A 62-year-old retired school teacher stood outside the house where she had learned to read, and strangers were inside discussing which walls to tear down first. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She had not been invited, and the only thing she carried was a dented sewing tin that had belonged to her dead mother. People in Chillicothe said Ruth had let her ex-husband walk all over her for years. They said she was too soft, too tired, too willing to believe a man who smiled while he lied. But what none of them knew was that inside that sewing tin, beneath 40 years of thread and buttons, Eleanor Calloway had hidden the one thing Harold Whitaker never wanted Ruth to find. Before we go further, if you believe that quiet people deserve the truth as much as loud ones, subscribe now. Because this story is about a woman who had almost forgotten the sound of her own voice and what happened when she finally used it. The house looked smaller than memory. That was the first cruelty. Not the sold sign staked in the front yard like a wound. Not the stranger's car parked where Eleanor's blue sedan used to sit, not even the sound of laughter drifting through the kitchen window. The cruelty was the shrinking. Ruth had carried this house inside her chest for 62 years, and now it looked like something a realtor would describe in 3 words: charming fixer-upper. The porch still leaned to the left. The white paint still curled near the gutters where Eleanor had never been tall enough to reach. The rosemary beneath the kitchen window was gone, pulled out like an afterthought, and in its place the new owners had set a ceramic pot with a plastic fern that would never need sunlight or love. Ruth stood at the gate, the cardboard box pressed against her hip. Inside it were 3 things the new owners had let her take: the sewing tin, a chipped teacup with a gold rim half worn away, and a recipe book so old the binding had been replaced twice with kitchen twine. The pages still carried flour dust from hands that would never touch dough again. She could hear Eleanor in that flour. Not her voice, not her words, just her presence, the way a room remembers the woman who stood in it longest. Ruth had been 7 years old the first time she understood that her mother spoke through her hands rather than her mouth. A Saturday morning. The kitchen table covered in a thin sheet of white. Eleanor rolling pie dough with steady, even pressure, the wooden pin turning slow as a prayer. The radio played something with strings. Flour hung in the air like the light had turned solid. Ruth had asked a question that morning. She could not remember what it was. But she remembered Eleanor's answer, which was no answer at all. Just a look, a half smile, and the sound of dough folding against itself. That silence had not been empty. It had been full of something Ruth spent the next 55 years trying to name. Now someone inside the house laughed again, and a woman's voice carried through the kitchen window, bright and sure of itself. The cabinets would have to go. Ruth closed her eyes. Those cabinets had been painted pale yellow by Eleanor during a summer, when money ran thin and pride was the only color left on the shelf. The brush strokes were uneven. One drawer swelled shut in August humidity. But Eleanor had done it alone, kneeling on the linoleum in her house dress. A cigarette she never lit, resting behind her ear like a promise she kept making to herself and never broke. Harold had hated those cabinets. He called them sentimental, and he used that word the way other men used profanity, as a weapon shaped like patience. Sentimental. As if remembering was a disease that only women caught. As if loving a kitchen made a person less intelligent than a man who knew the price of everything inside it. Ruth opened her eyes. The sold sign caught the late November light. She did not know standing there that Harold Whitaker had filed the paperwork for the sale using a signature she had never written. She did not know that her mother had spent the last weeks of her life hiding proof beneath old thread. She did not know about the cabin in the woods or the brass key or the letter that would split her life into before and after. All she knew was the weight of the box against her hip and the strange small sound that had come from inside the sewing tin when she shifted it 5 minutes ago. Metal against metal, something moving where nothing should have moved. Then her phone rang. Harold's name on the screen was a specific kind of violence, the kind that arrives dressed as normalcy. She had changed his contact name after the divorce. Just his first name now, no last name, no photo. as if removing the details could remove the man. His voice came through calm, measured, rehearsed, without sounding rehearsed. That was Harold's greatest talent. He could make cruelty sound like concern the way a jeweler could make glass look like diamond convincing enough in the right light. He said the sale was legal. He said she had agreed to it months ago. He said grief did strange things to memory, especially in women who had lived alone too long. Then he paused. And the pause was a room he wanted her to walk into, a room where she would start doubting herself, start rearranging what she knew until his version looked like the only furniture that fit. Ruth said nothing. Harold shifted strategies. His voice dropped half a register, the tone he used when he wanted to sound like a father rather than an ex-husband. He told her the medical bills had been substantial. He told her the house needed a new roof and a new foundation, things she could not afford on a retired teacher's pension. He told her he had done her a favor. Then he said the sentence that a guilty man should never say. His voice came through with a finality meant to close a door. "There's nothing left for you to find, Ruth." The words entered the car like cold air. Ruth sat with them for 3 full seconds. She did not respond. She ended the call, placed the phone face down on the passenger seat, and looked at the sewing tin sitting on top of the cardboard box. Nothing left to find. That was not comfort. That was a warning dressed as reassurance. Because if there was truly nothing left, Harold would not have needed to say so. Ruth drove away before the new owners could step outside and wave. She checked into a motel outside Chillicothe, just before the sky lost its last gray light. The room was the kind of place that did not ask questions. Thin carpet, a heater that clicked 3 times before each shallow breath of warmth, a lamp with a crooked shade that threw light against the wall at an angle that made the room look tilted, as if the whole building had given up trying to stand straight. Ruth placed the cardboard box on the small table near the window. The sewing tin sat on top, its painted flowers nearly rubbed away by decades of Eleanor's hands. Blue petals, green stems, a lid that no longer closed perfectly because one corner had been dented long before Ruth was born. She touched the tin the way a person touches something sacred without knowing why. Cold metal, ordinary weight. But her fingers did not move for a long time because the question beneath her hand was not small. If something was hidden inside this tin, then Harold's phone call had not been cruelty. It had been fear. She opened the lid. The smell arrived first, and it undid her more than anything Harold had ever said. Old cotton, lavender soap, thread that had absorbed years of dresser-drawer air. The faintest breath of Eleanor's bedroom, the room where Ruth had sat beside the hospital bed during those last weeks, holding a hand that grew lighter each day until it barely pressed back. Inside, the tin wooden spools wound tight with brown and white thread. Pearl buttons in a cluster like tiny moons. Needles tucked into a square of folded flannel. A silver thimble worn smooth at the tip from years of pushing needles through stubborn fabric. And beneath everything, scraps of cloth Eleanor had saved, because she believed every scrap might matter someday. Nothing secret, nothing strange. Ruth almost closed the lid and called herself foolish for hoping. Then she noticed the false bottom. The tray did not sit flat. One corner rose just enough to catch the motel light, a gap no wider than a coin. Ruth slid her fingernail beneath it and lifted. The tray came up with a soft exhale of stale air. Something dropped to the bottom of the tin. The same sound. Metal against metal. Ruth stopped breathing. A brass key lay against the tin's bare floor, darkened with age, heavy for its size, with a strip of yellow tape wrapped around its neck. On the tape, 2 initials written in Eleanor's careful hand. See, for one disoriented second, Ruth thought the initials were hers, Ruth Calloway. Then the photograph beneath the key rearranged the meaning. It was small, no bigger than a playing card, with a white border gone ivory with time. The image showed a cabin standing beneath heavy trees, weathered board walls, a stone chimney listing slightly right, a narrow porch with a single step. Behind the cabin, barely visible through branches, the thick trunk of a split oak, its 2 halves reaching in opposite directions like arms that had been pulled apart. Ruth sat down on the motel bed. The springs complained. The memory came in pieces as if her mind were unwrapping something it had stored away in cloth. She was 8 years old. Her grandmother, Rose Calloway, was driving an old green pickup down a road that was more rut than road. The truck smelled of tobacco rain and the peppermint candies Rose kept in the glove box. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, silent, holding something square and metal in her lap. A box. Ruth had asked if they were lost. Rose had laughed a single sharp sound, and her voice came through the memory with a clarity that startled. Some places only look lost so the wrong people won't find them. Ruth turned the photograph over. Eleanor's handwriting waited on the back, thin, precise, unmistakable, even after all these years. When you have nowhere else, go where your grandmother kept the truth. Ruth read the line twice, then a third time. The motel heater clicked. A car passed outside its headlights, sweeping across the curtain like a searchlight. R.C. Rose Calloway. The cabin belonged to her grandmother. The key opened something Rose had locked. And Eleanor had hidden both inside a sewing tin because she knew perhaps better than anyone that no one searches a dead woman's thread. Ruth reached back into the tin. Beneath the photograph, one more piece of paper folded into a strip so small it could have been mistaken for a scrap of cloth. She opened it with fingers that had begun to tremble. A property marker number. And below it one sentence in Eleanor's hand written smaller than the rest, as if the words themselves wanted to hide. If the ground has been turned, do not dig until you know who came before you. Ruth lowered the paper. The heater clicked. The room held still. And the shape of what Eleanor had done began to emerge not all at once, but like a figure stepping out of fog. Her mother had not simply left behind a key. She had left behind a map, a destination and a warning. Someone dangerous had been looking for what Rose Calloway had hidden, and Eleanor had feared that person long before Ruth understood who it was. Ruth did not sleep. She read the note so many times the words stopped being ink and started feeling like a hand resting on her shoulder. By sunrise, she had made coffee in the motel lobby from a machine that produced something closer to warm regret than caffeine. She packed the box into her car. She placed the photograph on the passenger seat, and she pulled onto the road out of Chillicothe before the town had finished waking. Bravery at 62 did not arrive like fire. It arrived like tired hands turning an ignition key in a cold parking lot. It looked like an older woman squinting at a property marker number on a folded scrap of paper. It looked like not going home because home had been sold by a man who believed silence was the same as permission. The road narrowed after the second county turn. Pavement became gravel. Gravel became dirt. Dirt became a rutted lane that the woods had spent years trying to swallow. Bare branches scraped both sides of the car like fingers testing whether she was real. November mist sat low over the hollows. The hills rose gently on either side, covered in oak and hickory, stripped bare, their branches holding the gray sky like cracks in old porcelain. Every few hundred yards, Ruth glanced at the photograph on the passenger seat. The split oak behind the cabin. That was the landmark she needed. Not a memory, not a feeling. A tree that had been torn in half and kept growing anyway. Her phone lost signal after the first creek crossing. The silence that replaced it was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has been waiting. Then she saw the cabin. Smaller than memory, darker too. The weathered boards had gone the color of wet ash. The stone chimney leaned right, same as in the photograph. The porch step had sunk into the earth on one side. Behind the cabin, the split oak stood enormous against the sky, its two trunks rising 30 feet before separating the bark between them, scarred and ridged, where the tree had torn itself apart and healed over decades. Ruth stopped the car. The engine ticked into silence. Then she looked at the ground in front of her, and her breath thinned. Tire tracks, pressed deep into the soft mud of the lane. Fresh. Recent enough that rain had not softened the edges. Someone had driven to this cabin, this forgotten place that should not have existed on anyone's map, and they had done it recently. Ruth sat in the car for a long time. The woods did not move. The cabin did not move. The tire tracks did not explain themselves. She thought about turning around. That would have been easy. Drive back to the motel. Call no one. Tell herself the note was old. The tracks belonged to a hunter. The key was a coincidence. She had spent decades making excuses for things that frightened her. She was, if nothing else, very practiced at explaining away the evidence of her own instincts. But Eleanor's sentence sat in her coat pocket like a stone. If the ground has been turned, do not dig until you know who came before you. Her mother had not written that for a woman who would turn around. Ruth stepped out of the car. The cold entered her coat immediately. An Ohio November cold that did not bite, but pressed steady and patient against every joint. Under her shoes, the mud held the tire tracks like a confession. She followed them with her eyes. They ran to the cabin, then cut hard into the dirt in a turning circle, deep gouges that spoke of hurry. Whoever had come had not lingered. They had searched and left. She climbed the porch step. The wood bent and groaned beneath her weight, a sound like an old house clearing its throat. The front door was closed. The lock wore fresh scratches, bright lines in the old brass marks that had not been made by weather. Ruth took out the key. Her hand shook once. She steadied it the way Eleanor used to steady a needle before pushing it through thick fabric, not with force, with focus. The key turned. The cabin opened. Inside smelled of dust, cold ash, and pine so old it had become part of the walls. Light fell through the dirty windows in pale strips, illuminating the room in pieces. A table, 2 chairs, a black iron stove with a pipe that disappeared into the ceiling. Shelves along one wall lined with mason jars, folded cloth, and objects too ordinary to notice on a first glance. Ruth noticed on the second glance. The dust near the stove had been disturbed. A braided rug lay crooked one corner, folded under, as if someone had lifted it to check the floor beneath. A drawer under the table sat open by an inch. On the far wall, a shelf had been shifted just enough to leave a clean line where it had rested for years. Someone had searched this cabin, not carefully, not like family, like a person who knew something was hidden, but did not know exactly where to look. Near the back door, a muddy boot print marked the floorboards, partial but large, a man's boot. The back door latch had been splintered where someone had forced it from outside. Ruth stood in the center of the room and listened to the cabin settle around her. She could hear the oak tree outside creaking in a wind she could not feel. She could hear her own pulse. Then she walked to the back door and opened it. Behind the cabin, the ground sloped toward the split oak. Its 2 trunks rose apart from each other with the patience of something that had learned to survive being broken. Beneath the oak, the earth was wrong. Most of the ground was packed hard with November frost. But one patch, roughly 3 feet square, looked darker, softer, recently turned. A shovel leaned against the cabin wall, half hidden behind dry goldenrod stalks. The blade was muddy. The handle was clean. Ruth looked at the turned earth. She looked at the shovel. She reached into her coat pocket and touched Eleanor's note. If the ground has been turned, do not dig until you know who came before you. But Ruth already knew who had come before her. The polished shoes, the calm voice, the man who had sold her mother's house and then called to tell her there was nothing left to find. She took the shovel. The first cut into the earth was easier than it should have been. The soil was loose, recently moved, and it gave way under the blade like a secret that was tired of being kept. Ruth dug slowly. Her shoulders protested. Her knees sent sharp complaints up through her legs. Cold mud climbed the hem of her coat. The shovel struck metal. The sound was dull final, like a period at the end of a sentence no one wanted to read. Ruth dropped to her knees and moved the remaining dirt by hand. Her fingers found oilcloth, first blackened with soil, wrapped tight around something rectangular and heavy. She pulled it free, inch by inch, until a metal box emerged from the ground, no bigger than a bread loaf. A latch on the front bent outward, scratched by something sharp. Someone had tried to force it open. The scratches were frantic, gouged deep, the marks of a man who had expected the box to yield, and then discovered that Ruth Calloway had bought a lock that did not care about impatience. The lock was still intact. Ruth carried the box into the cabin and set it on the table. She took the brass key from her pocket. R.C. Rose Calloway. The key her grandmother had locked away, and her mother had hidden inside a sewing tin full of thread and buttons and lavender-scented cloth, the last place a man like Harold would ever think to search. The key fit. The lock turned with a sound that seemed to travel through the cabin walls and out into the trees and across the cold Ohio hills, a sound like something that had been waiting a very long time to be opened. Inside the box, wrapped in plastic that had kept the moisture out for years, a property survey, a bank envelope thick with photocopied records, a folded document stamped by the county, and on top of everything resting like the first page of a story that had been written in secret, a letter. Ruth knew the handwriting before her mind could accept what it meant. Eleanor's hand, her mother's hand, the same hand that had rolled pie dough painted cabinet's yellow stitched buttons onto winter coats and reached for Ruth's wrist in a hospital room while Harold smiled in the hallway. The envelope said only Ruth, not formal, not legal, just her name written the way a mother writes a name she chose before the child was born, with all the tenderness that choosing contains. Ruth sat down. The cabin held its breath. She opened the letter. It did not begin with fear. It did not begin with Harold or the house or the land or the law. It began with something Eleanor had never said aloud, perhaps because some truths are too large for a living room and need the privacy of paper. Eleanor wrote that she had watched Harold for years. She wrote that she had seen how he answered questions meant for Ruth, how he corrected her gently in front of company, how he made decisions with Ruth's name but without Ruth's voice. She wrote that she had seen the way Ruth's shoulders changed shape over the years, pulling inward, curling forward as if her body were trying to protect something her mind had stopped defending. Then Eleanor wrote the line that broke the room open. She wrote that Ruth was not weak and not foolish and not blind. She wrote that Ruth was tired, and she had married a man who understood that exhaustion and consent looked the same from the outside. Ruth pressed her hand against her mouth. No one had ever named it. Not her friends, not her sister, not her doctor, not the counselor she saw twice and never returned to. No one had ever looked at the shape of Ruth's life and said plainly, without judgment, what had been done to her and how it had been done. Eleanor had. In a letter hidden inside a metal box buried beneath an oak tree at the end of a road that only the right woman could find, Ruth read on. Eleanor wrote that she had suspected Harold was asking about the house for reasons that had nothing to do with protection. So before her illness took the last of her strength, she had contacted an old attorney, a man named Martin Keane, who had once worked with Rose. Eleanor explained the cabin and the land. 16 wooded acres had been placed in a separate trust by Rose Calloway years earlier. Eleanor had updated the paperwork. Ruth was the sole beneficiary. Only Ruth, not Harold. Not any creditor, not any man who arrived with a calm voice and a pen. Beneath the letter lay the proof. The property survey marked the cabin and its acreage. The county document carried Ruth's name in typed legal language. The bank envelope held photocopies of old records Eleanor had gathered because she feared Harold would search the house after her death. And then Ruth saw the last page. A copy of a document she had supposedly signed. An authority document giving Harold the right to make decisions connected to Eleanor's estate. The signature at the bottom said, Ruth Calloway. But the R leaned too hard. The C was cramped. The line beneath the name pressed deep, impatient, heavy-handed. Ruth held the page under the window light. Then she looked at her own signature on her driver's license, the one she had written thousands of times across decades of school forms and grocery checks and birthday cards. They did not match. Close enough for a clerk who was not looking. Close enough for a notary who was already on Harold's side. But not close enough for the woman whose name it was. And the date, February 11th. Ruth did not need a calendar. She remembered February 11th the way a body remembers a wound. The hospital had called before dawn. Eleanor's breathing had worsened overnight. Ruth had driven through darkness with her coat over her nightgown, certain she would arrive too late. She had spent the entire day in a room with a blue curtain, a plastic chair, a cup of ice chips, and the sound of her mother breathing in intervals that grew longer and longer, like a clock that was forgetting how to keep time. She had not left that room. She had not signed any document. She had not been in any office. Harold had come to the hospital that evening. He had kissed Ruth's forehead in front of the nurse, then whispered that he had handled a few things so she would not have to worry. Handled. That word returned now wearing a different face. Ruth lowered the documents to the table. The letter, the trust, the forged signature, the impossible date. Outside, the split oak creaked in a wind that moved through the hollow like a long-held breath finally released. Inside the cabin, the sewing tin sat in the cardboard box where Ruth had left it. Its painted flowers faced the window. Its dented corner caught the last November light. Eleanor had placed a key inside a sewing tin because she knew that no one searches the ordinary belongings of a dead woman. She had wrapped the truth in thread and buttons and lavender cloth because she understood something Harold never would. The things that look worthless are the things that survive. Ruth folded the letter carefully. She placed it back in the box. She closed the lid but did not lock it. There was no need to lock it anymore. The truth was out of the ground, and Ruth Calloway was just beginning to understand what her mother had buried it to protect. Ruth drove back toward Chillicothe with the metal box wrapped in an old towel on the passenger seat. Every bump in the road made the papers shift inside a dry whisper that sounded like her mother turning pages. The photograph of the cabin still rested on the dashboard. The sewing tin sat in the cardboard box behind her, its lid slightly open as if it too were breathing easier now. She did not feel brave. She felt like a woman carrying a question no one had taught her how to ask. The county records office occupied the ground floor of a brick building near the courthouse square, wedged between a tax office and a room where people renewed license plates. It was the kind of place Ruth had walked past for 30 years without once wondering what lived inside. Deeds, transfers, names and dates and signatures. The quiet architecture of ownership, the way a town remembered who belonged to what, and who had tried to take what did not belong to them. Ruth parked across the street. She sat for a full minute before reaching for the metal box. Her hands were cold. Her coat smelled of cabin dust and November mud. She caught her reflection in the rearview mirror and almost did not recognize the woman looking back. Not because she looked different, because she looked awake. Inside, the office smelled of toner, old folders, and coffee that had been sitting on a burner long enough to develop a personality. A woman behind the counter looked up from her computer, silver hair pinned neatly, reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain, a face that had seen enough confused, frightened, angry people walk through that door to know the difference between someone looking for trouble and someone looking for proof. Ruth expected impatience. Instead, the woman waited. That small mercy almost undid her. Ruth had spent so many years around a man who interrupted that she had forgotten what it felt like to be given the full length of a silence. She placed the metal box on the counter. She gave her name, her mother's name, the parcel number from Eleanor's note. Her voice held steady until she asked for records connected to the cabin trust, the land and the sale of Eleanor's house. At the mention of the sale, the clerk paused. Not long, but long enough for Ruth to recognize the stillness of someone seeing a problem on a screen and deciding how honest to be about it. The first records came slowly. The cabin parcel existed exactly as Eleanor's letter described. 16 acres wooded separate from the house property. Rose Calloway's name appeared first in the chain of ownership, then Eleanor's, then Ruth's. Clear, direct, no Harold, no shared title, no ambiguity. Ruth stared at the printout until the letters stopped swimming. For the first time since the sold sign, something official carried her name without Harold's fingerprints on it. But the clerk was not finished. She pulled another screen, then another. The sale of Eleanor's house had been processed with an authority document attached the same type Ruth had found in the metal box. Same format, same date, February 11th. The clerk's fingers paused above the keyboard. She did not say the word forgery. She did not need to. Then came the detail that made the floor feel uneven. There had been a separate records request filed months before the house sale, a request for information on the cabin parcel. The requester's name sat on the form in ink that looked like it had been written by a man who had never once doubted his right to anything, Harold Whittaker. He had searched for the cabin before selling the house. He had not stumbled into this. He had planned it step by careful step like a man laying tile in someone else's kitchen, measuring twice, cutting once, making sure the edges were clean. The clerk printed the request form and slid it across the counter. At the bottom, a typed note from the records office copy requested for private property valuation. Ruth read the word valuation twice. Harold had not been searching for family history. He had been searching for worth. The clerk hesitated, then said there might be archived trust references in the back system that were not visible on the main screen. Older records sometimes required a manual search. She disappeared through a door lined with filing cabinets. Ruth waited. 5 minutes. 10. The clock above the counter ticked with the patience of something that would still be ticking long after everyone in the room was gone. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past the courthouse. A woman walked a dog across the square. The world continued its ordinary business while Ruth stood at a counter holding evidence of a crime committed by a man she had once promised to love. The clerk returned with a thin folder, yellowed label, Peterson Calloway Family Trust. She opened it on the counter and looked down. Then her expression shifted, not to shock, to the careful blankness of a professional who has found something that will matter to someone standing 3 feet away. She turned the folder toward Ruth. The trust language was dense, but the key sentence was not. The cabin land was protected from transfer sale or outside claim unless Ruth Calloway appeared in person and signed before 2 independent witnesses. Ruth had never done that. She had never been asked. She had never been told such a requirement existed because Harold had made sure she was too exhausted, too grieving, too buried in hospital schedules and medication charts to ask questions about paper. The clerk reached quietly for the phone. She did not explain who she was calling. Ruth did not ask. Some things at that point did not need explanation. They only needed to begin. Ruth left the records office with copies pressed flat inside a brown envelope. The sidewalk outside the courthouse felt different under her feet, not because the concrete had changed, but because Ruth had. She was not a woman carrying grief anymore. She was a woman carrying evidence. Then her phone rang. Harold did not open with anger. That would have required honesty. He opened with concern, the manufactured kind, the kind that arrives pre-wrapped in a voice meant to sound like worry, but structured like control. He said he had heard she was asking questions downtown. He said small towns had loose mouths. He said he was worried she was embarrassing herself over things she did not fully understand. Ruth walked. She did not stop. She did not sit down on the bench outside the courthouse to receive his voice more comfortably. She kept moving because standing still while Harold spoke had been the posture of her marriage, and she was finished with it. Harold told her trusts were complicated. He told her Eleanor had never been sharp with legal matters. He told her Rose Calloway had been stubborn enough to create problems that outlived her. That was the first crack. Harold had never spoken Rose's name before, not once in 27 years of marriage. Rose Calloway had been a silence in Harold's vocabulary, and silences in Harold's vocabulary were never accidental. They were walls he built around things he did not want examined. Ruth's hand tightened around the phone. She kept walking. Harold shifted into a lower register the tone he saved for what he considered his final authority. He said lawyers would take her money. He said clerks would pretend to care. He said people would nod at her face and laugh the moment she left the room. He said she would end up alone, embarrassed, and poorer than she already was. Still, Ruth said nothing. The silence unsettled him. She could hear it in the way his breathing changed the small hitch between sentences, where he expected her to fill the gap with apology or confusion, or the soft deflation he had trained her to produce. Then Harold made his mistake. His voice came through steady, almost dismissive. "Whatever you think was in that box, Ruth, it doesn't change a thing." The sentence entered Ruth's ear and traveled through her body slowly, the way cold water moves through a crack in stone. That box. She had not told Harold about the metal box. She had not told anyone except the county clerk that she had documents. She had not described the box, named the box, or mentioned its existence to any living person. Harold knew about the box because he had seen it, because he had knelt in the mud beneath the split oak and pulled it from the ground, and scratched at its lock with something sharp and buried it again when the lock refused to open. Outside the courthouse, a truck passed slowly. Its engine sound faded down the block like the end of a sentence. Harold seemed to hear the silence change. He corrected himself. He said he meant whatever old papers Eleanor might have left behind. He said old women hid things all the time. He said Ruth was building a fantasy from grief and dust. But the damage had been done. The word was out of his mouth, and it could not be put back. That box, specific, present, real. Ruth spoke. Not loudly, not with the anger she had every right to carry, just clearly the way a woman speaks when she has stopped performing her own smallness. Her voice came through soft, almost conversational. "The records office was very helpful, Harold." The silence on his end was not a pause. It was a wall falling. Then Harold said she was making a mistake. Ruth looked at the courthouse steps, the brick, the public doors, the place where names and dates outlived the men who tried to erase them. She ended the call. Her hands shook afterward. Of course they did. 30 years of control does not leave the nervous system in a single afternoon. But she did not call him back. She did not explain. She did not rearrange her own courage into something smaller so it would fit inside Harold's comfort. She placed the phone in her pocket and looked at the brown envelope in her hand. Then she reached into the metal box and found the card she had almost overlooked beneath Eleanor's letter. Martin Keane, attorney at law. The old number crossed out, a newer one beneath it written in Eleanor's hand. Eleanor had not left the card by accident. She had left it the way she left everything, quietly, precisely hidden among ordinary things, so that only the right person would know to look. The office of Martin Keane occupied 2 rooms above a hardware store on Payne Street, 4 blocks from the courthouse square. The stairs were narrow. The banister had been replaced once and painted twice, but still wobbled at the landing. A woman at a small desk near the door told Ruth that Martin was semi-retired, that he came in 3 mornings a week for what he called old family matters. Ruth looked at the metal box under her arm. That was exactly what this was. Martin Keane was 82 years old, thin, silver-haired, seated behind a desk covered in folders and a coffee cup that had been refilled so many times. The inside was stained the color of walnut. He did not stand when Ruth entered, but he looked at her the way certain old men look at certain old women, with the recognition that comes from having lived long enough to know what trouble looks like when it walks through a door carrying a box. When Ruth placed the metal box on his desk, he did not ask what it was. He touched the lid the way a person touches a book they have been waiting to read. Then his voice came through quiet, almost to himself. Eleanor Calloway was always smarter than people gave her credit for. That was when Ruth knew she had come to the right place. She gave him everything. The letter, the trust documents, the property survey, the county records, the request form with Harold's name, the authority document with the signature that could not be hers because she had been holding her dying mother's hand on the afternoon it was supposedly written. Martin read the way a surgeon operates slowly, not because of age, but because he understood what careless reading could cost. He placed each page on the desk the way a man places stones on a grave, one at a time, each one heavy with what it meant. Page by page, the architecture of Harold's deception became visible. Ruth Calloway had created the Cabin Trust decades earlier. The language was airtight. Eleanor had updated it before her death. Ruth was the sole beneficiary. The land could not be transferred without Ruth's personal witness signature. Then Martin placed Harold's records request beside the forged authority document. Months before the sale, Harold had searched for information on the cabin parcel. He had known about the land, he had known about the trust, and he had moved to sell Eleanor's house before Ruth could discover what her mother and grandmother had protected. Ruth handed Martin the hospital record from Eleanor's file. February 11th. Eleanor admitted before dawn. Ruth listed as present through the afternoon and evening. Martin set the hospital record beside the forged signature. The two documents sat on his desk like opposing witnesses in a trial that had not yet begun. He looked at them for a long time. Then his voice came through, measured the voice of a man who had spent 50 years choosing words the way other men chose tools. Harold Whitaker has a real problem. He did not smile. He did not promise victory. He did not perform confidence. He simply stated a fact and let it sit on the desk beside the evidence. Ruth felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope, not yet. Something closer to the moment before hope, the moment when a person realizes that what they know might actually matter to someone other than themselves. Martin told her the process would not be quick. Real justice, he said, moved at the speed of paper, and paper moved at the speed of people willing to read it carefully. There would be filings, responses, letters from Harold's attorney designed to sound final, but meaning nothing. There would be moments when Ruth would want to quit. He said that plainly without softening it because he respected her enough not to pretend the road was short. Ruth nodded. She did not ask how long. She had spent 30 years waiting for Harold to become someone he would never be. She could wait for a system that at least had the decency to read the documents. 3 days later, Ruth returned to the cabin with a broom, a box of kitchen matches, and a bag of groceries from the general store in Chillicothe. She swept the floor. Harold's boots had muddied. She built a fire in the black iron stove and waited until the heat reached the center of the room. She boiled water for coffee in a pot she found on the shelf, a pot Ruth Calloway had likely used its handle worn smooth by decades of a woman's grip. The cabin was not comfortable. The roof leaked near the stovepipe. The back steps sagged. The windows let in drafts that moved through the room like uninvited guests. But it was hers. Legally, historically, generationally hers. And for the first time in longer than she could name, Ruth occupied a space that no one had given her permission to be in because no permission was required. She started with the porch step. It took her most of a morning to remove the rotted board, and the replacement she cut from a plank found in the woodshed was uneven at one end. She sanded it by hand until her fingers ached, then nailed it into place with nails that were slightly too long, so their tips poked through the underside like small silver teeth. It was not good carpentry. Eleanor would have said it had character. The next morning, a truck appeared on the cabin road. Ruth heard it before she saw it, the crunch of tires on frozen ruts, the low rumble of an engine that had been running for 40 years, and saw no reason to stop. She stepped onto the porch, onto the step she had built, and waited. The man who climbed out was broad white-haired and moved the way old trees move in wind, slowly and only when necessary. He wore a canvas jacket, work boots, and a cap that looked like it had been sat on by every dog he had ever owned. Walter Briggs. He lived 3 miles down the ridge in a house he had built with his father in 1971. He had known Ruth Calloway. He did not introduce himself with his name. He introduced himself with lumber. 4 planks of white oak seasoned stacked in the bed of his truck. He carried them to the porch without being asked, and set them down with the care of a man who understood that wood, like people, should not be dropped. His voice came through rough and unhurried. Rose said if the cabin ever woke up again, the porch would need these. Ruth looked at the planks. She looked at Walter. She did not ask how he knew she was here, in a town like Chillicothe, in a county where the hills carried sound and gossip traveled faster than weather. A woman returning to a cabin that had been silent for decades was not a secret. It was an event. Walter did not stay long. He drank 1 cup of coffee, standing in the doorway, looking out at the split oak the way a man looks at something he has watched grow for half his life. Before he left, he told Ruth that he had seen a truck parked near the cabin road 2 months earlier. Dark truck. A man in clean boots, the kind of boots that had never touched real mud before that day. Walter had not approached. He had watched from the ridge. The man had gone into the cabin, stayed for 20 minutes, then come around the back. Walter heard digging. Then the man left in a hurry, spinning his tires in the mud. Ruth asked if the man had been tall, with pressed clothes, and a way of standing that made him look like he was waiting to be photographed. Walter's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. "That's the one." After Walter left, Ruth stood on the porch and looked at the oak planks leaning against the railing. She had not asked for help. Walter had not offered it. He had simply arrived as if the cabin itself had sent for what it needed. 2 days later, the fabric arrived. Not at the cabin, at the general store in Chillicothe, where Ruth had been buying lamp oil and canned soup. The woman behind the counter, Della Finch, was small, sharp-eyed, and wore a measuring tape around her neck like a scarf. She owned the fabric shop next door, and she had known Eleanor for 30 years. Della did not say much. She handed Ruth a paper bag. Inside were 3 yards of pale blue cotton, the same blue Eleanor had used to paint the kitchen cabinets, folded neatly, and pinned with a note that said only, "Your mother ordered this. I never got to deliver it." Ruth held the fabric against her chest. The blue was exact. Eleanor's blue. The blue of a woman who painted her own kitchen because no one else was going to do it for her. Della watched Ruth hold the fabric, then said one quiet thing that rearranged the air in the room. Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were giving a sewing measurement. "Eleanor came in 6 weeks before she passed. She bought 2 yards of muslin and asked me to sew a small pouch with a drawstring. She said it needed to be strong enough to hold a key." Ruth looked up. Della continued without changing tone. "She said the key was for her daughter, and the pouch was going inside an old tin. I didn't ask questions. Your mother wasn't the kind of woman who explained herself when she'd already made up her mind." The pouch. The drawstring pouch Ruth had found inside the sewing tin. The one she had assumed was just another scrap of Eleanor's endless fabric collection. Eleanor had commissioned it. She had walked into Della's shop, sick, weakening weeks from death, and ordered a small bag strong enough to protect a brass key from time and carelessness and the hands of a man who would search a house but never think to search a sewing tin. Ruth thanked Della, could not say more than that without her voice failing, so she carried the bag of blue fabric to her car and sat with it on her lap until the parking lot emptied. Then Martin called. His voice was the same as it had been in his office, steady, precise, a voice that did not waste air. He had found something in the county's notary records, the notary who had witnessed Harold's authority document. The one bearing Ruth's forged signature was not an independent officer. His name was Gerald Whittaker, Harold's second cousin, a man who processed insurance claims in a small office on the east side of Chillicothe and held a notary stamp he used mostly for his own business filings. The signature had been forged. The notary had been family. The entire transaction had been built on a foundation of blood and silence. Martin said this changed the weight of everything. A forged signature was serious. A forged signature notarized by a relative was a pattern. And a pattern, Martin said in the voice of a man who had watched the law work for 50 years, was something a judge could see. Ruth sat in the cabin that evening with the stove ticking softly and the blue fabric folded on the table beside Eleanor's letter. Outside, the split oak stood against a sky turning the color of iron. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the strange exhaustion that comes after a long illness when the fever breaks. But the body has not yet remembered how to be well, because Harold's letter arrived the next morning. Not Harold himself, his attorney. A firm in Columbus with a name that sounded like a law office in a film about men who never lost. The letter was 3 pages typed single-spaced, printed on paper heavy enough to feel like a verdict. It called Ruth emotionally compromised. It called her claims baseless. It suggested that grief had distorted her perception and that pursuing legal action would result in financial consequences she was not prepared to bear. It used the word sentimental twice. Ruth read it at the cabin table. The stove had gone cold. The blue fabric sat folded beside her elbow. Eleanor's letter rested in the metal box on the shelf. She read the attorney's letter once, then again. The language was designed to do what Harold had always done, to make Ruth feel that her own experience was unreliable, that her own memory was a house with a cracked foundation, that the simple act of believing what she knew was an indulgence she could not afford. For one long moment it worked. Ruth put the letter down and looked at her hands. They were 62 years old. They had graded papers, braided hair, held dying fingers, dug through frozen mud, and nailed a porch board that was slightly crooked. They were not lawyers' hands. They were not Harold's hands. They did not know how to hold a fight. Then she looked at the sewing tin. It sat on the shelf where she had placed it the first night. Dented, painted with faded flowers, ordinary enough to be invisible. And inside it, beneath the thread and buttons and the silver thimble worn smooth by Eleanor's thumb, was the space where the brass key had waited year after year for the right woman to find it. Eleanor had not been a lawyer either. She had been a seamstress who taught herself to sew because she could not afford to pay someone else. She had painted cabinets with uneven strokes. She had hidden a key inside a tin. She had written a letter that named the truth without flinching. And she had done all of it while dying. Ruth picked up a pen. She found a clean sheet of paper in the cabin drawer. She wrote 5 words to Martin Keane. I need that in writing. Not eloquent, not legal, but clear. The kind of clear that does not need volume-only certainty. The kind of clear a woman arrives at not through confidence, but through the slow, exhausted refusal to pretend that what happened did not happen. She mailed the note the next morning. Then she came back to the cabin and built a fire and waited, because waiting was the only brave thing left to do. And Ruth had learned that bravery was not always a door kicked open. Sometimes it was a woman sitting in a chair. She had earned letting the fire warm a room that belonged to her, while the law did what the law was built to do. 4 days passed. Martin filed. Harold's attorney responded. Martin responded to the response. Paper moved. Ruth split kindling. She patched the cabin window with plastic sheeting and duct tape. She swept the floor every morning because Eleanor had swept her floor every morning, and the habit felt like conversation with a woman who was no longer alive but had never fully left. Then Harold came to the cabin. Ruth heard the truck before she saw it. Not Walter's truck, which announced itself with the comfortable rattle of age. This engine was newer, smoother, the sound of a man who leased rather than owned. Tires crunched over frozen ground. A door opened and closed with the controlled force of someone who wanted the sound to arrive before he did. Ruth stepped onto the porch. The step she had built held firm beneath her weight. Harold stood at the edge of the clearing. He wore the heavy brown boots she remembered, the ones he had bought for a property inspection and worn once to Eleanor's house, leaving mud on the kitchen mat that Ruth had cleaned without being asked. His coat was pressed. His hair was combed. He looked like a man arriving at a business meeting, and that was exactly how he wanted it to look. His voice came through the cold air with the same manufactured calm she had listened to for 3 decades. The calm of a man who believed that composure was the same as authority. Ruth, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Ruth stood on the porch. He stood on the ground. For the first time in their shared history, she was looking down at him. Harold told her she was damaging the family. He said Eleanor would be ashamed. He said the legal process would drain her savings and leave her with nothing but a cabin that needed a new roof and a reputation that would follow her through every church supper and grocery aisle in Chillicothe. He spoke the way he had always spoken, as if his voice were the weather, and Ruth was something that needed to come inside. Ruth listened. She let him finish, not because she owed him silence, but because she wanted to hear whether he would say anything true. He did not. When he stopped the clearing, held the quiet the way a glass holds water full to the rim, trembling. A bird called once from the oak tree. The stove inside the cabin ticked. Ruth spoke. Her voice did not rise. It did not shake. It came through the November air the way Eleanor's handwriting moved across paper. Steady, certain, shaped by years of practice at making small things hold. You knew about the box, Harold. You knew about the cabin. And you came here before I did. Harold's face did not change. That was the most frightening thing. A man who hears the truth about himself and does not flinch is a man who decided long ago that the truth was someone else's problem. He turned. He walked back to his truck. He drove away without spinning his tires, without slamming the door, without any gesture that might look like guilt. He left the way he had always left, neatly, as if his departure were a favor. Ruth watched the truck disappear into the trees. The sound of the engine faded. The clearing settled back into silence. Then the silence settled into her. She sat down on the porch step. The oak plank Walter had brought was solid beneath her. The split oak stood beyond the cabin, its two trunks reaching in opposite directions against a sky that was darkening too early, the way November skies do in Ohio, as if the season itself were tired of holding up the light. Ruth looked at her hands. She looked at the cabin door. She looked at the trees closing in around the clearing, like a sentence that was almost finished. And for the first time since she had opened the sewing tin, Ruth was not sure she could do this. Not because the evidence was weak, not because Martin was wrong, not because Harold was right, but because fighting required a kind of energy that 30 years of marriage to a man like Harold had trained out of her, the way wind trains a tree to lean slowly, invisibly, until the lean feels like standing straight. Inside the cabin, the stove had gone cold. The blue fabric sat on the table. Eleanor's letter waited in the metal box on the shelf, and the sewing tin with its faded flowers and dented corner, and empty space where the key had been sat in the window light, like a question Ruth was afraid to answer. Could she carry this to the end, or had Harold already taken the last thing she did not know she had? Ruth did not build a fire that night. She sat in the dark cabin with her coat still on and her hands folded in her lap, listening to the oak tree creak outside the window, like a door that kept opening and closing on a room she could not see. Harold's words had not been new. They were the same words he had always used, rearranged into different sentences, the way a man rearranges furniture in a house he believes he owns. But something about hearing them here in Rose's cabin, on the porch Ruth had repaired with her own uneven hands, made them heavier than they had been before. She sat with that weight for a long time. Sometime after midnight, the cold forced her to move. She stood, crossed the room in darkness, and reached for the matches on the shelf. Her hand found the sewing tin first. She did not mean to touch it, but her fingers recognized the shape before her mind caught up the dented corner, the faded flowers, the lid that no longer closed properly, because time had bent the metal just enough to let the air in. She held it, not to search it. There was nothing left to find inside. The key was gone. The photograph was pinned to the wall. The drawstring pouch Della had sewn sat empty on the table. The tin held only what it had always held: thread buttons, needles, a silver thimble worn smooth by Eleanor's thumb. Ruth opened the lid in the dark. The smell rose like a hand reaching for her face. Lavender, old cotton, the ghost of a dresser drawer in a house that no longer belonged to her. She closed her eyes and let the smell hold her. And somewhere inside that small, ordinary moment, the answer arrived. Not as words, not as decision, as memory. Eleanor sitting beside the window in the late afternoon light falling across her lap. A needle in her right hand, a square of fabric in her left. She was not sewing anything important. A button on a coat Ruth had nearly outgrown. A tear in a dishcloth that could have been replaced for less than $1. But Eleanor sewed it anyway, slowly, carefully, as if the act of repair were the point rather than the result. Ruth had asked her once as a teenager, impatient with everything, why she bothered fixing things that were barely worth keeping. Eleanor had not looked up. Her needle moved through the cloth, pulling the thread tight, and her voice came through low, almost absent, as if she was speaking to the fabric rather than her daughter. Because mending is how you remember what matters. Ruth opened her eyes. The cabin was still dark. The cold was still there. Harold's voice was still circling inside her, like a bird that could not find a window. But the tin was in her hands, and Eleanor's voice was closer than Harold's, and Ruth understood something she had not understood before. She did not need to be strong the way Harold was strong. Harold's strength was a locked door. It kept everything out, including the truth. Ruth's strength could be different. It could be Eleanor's kind, the strength of a woman who sits down with a needle and mends what is torn not because the world demands it, but because the mending itself is the proof that something is worth saving. Ruth lit the match. She built the fire. She boiled water. She sat at the table with coffee she had made in Ruth Calloway's pot. And she waited for morning the way Eleanor had waited for bread to rise, not with urgency, with trust. At 9 o'clock, she called Martin Keane. She told him she was not quitting. She told him to file whatever needed filing. She told him she had 5 words, and those 5 words had not changed. I need that in writing. Martin was quiet for a moment. Then he said there was something new, something the county records had turned up during a secondary review. The notary who had witnessed Harold's authority document, Gerald Whitaker, had let his notary commission lapse 6 weeks before February 11th. The stamp on Ruth's forged signature had been applied by a man who was not at the time of stamping legally authorized to notarize anything. Ruth set her coffee cup down. The forgery was no longer just a question of handwriting. It was a question of a dead stamp on a live document, a legal impossibility that could not be argued away by Harold's attorneys, could not be softened by claims of confusion, could not be buried under letters that called Ruth sentimental or emotionally compromised. Martin said this was the kind of detail that changed rooms, not courtrooms, conference rooms, the rooms where men like Harold sat across from men like Martin and calculated whether the fight was still worth winning. That evening, Ruth sat at the cabin table, organizing the contents of the metal box for Martin's final review. She lifted each document carefully, stacking the copies, aligning the edges. When she reached the bottom, her fingers caught on something she had missed the first time. A small envelope no bigger than a playing card pressed flat against the base of the box and held in place by the same oilcloth that had protected everything else. She opened it. Inside was a photograph. Black and white, soft at the edges, the kind of image that comes from a camera held by someone who is not a photographer, but who understands that some moments must be caught before they leave. Eleanor stood in front of the cabin. Young, maybe 25. Her hair was dark and pulled back. Her dress was plain, and in her arms, wrapped in a blanket that looked hand-sewn, was a baby. Ruth turned the photograph over. Eleanor's handwriting weighted on the back, younger than the handwriting in the letter, steadier, written by a hand that had not yet learned what illness and fear would later teach it. This land is not about money. It is about making sure you always have a place where no one can tell you to leave. Ruth held the photograph for a long time. The baby in the picture did not know about Harold, did not know about forged signatures or sold houses or brass keys hidden in sewing tins. The baby only knew the arms holding her, and the woman in those arms had already decided before Ruth could speak or walk or understand that her daughter would have ground to stand on. Ruth placed the photograph on the wall beside the window. Not in a frame, just pinned there the way Eleanor would have done it, simple and permanent and exactly where the morning light would find it. 2 weeks later, Ruth returned to Martin's office for what he called the final review. The evidence was assembled. The timeline was clear. Eleanor's hospital records, Ruth's presence at the bedside, the forged signature filed across town, the expired notary stamp, Harold's records request for the cabin parcel months before the sale, the family connection between Harold and the notary, and Harold's own words on the phone, the mention of a box Ruth had never described to him. Martin had built the case the way Rose Calloway had built the trust, carefully with materials that would last, leaving nothing loose for a careless hand to pull apart. The settlement conference took place in a room Ruth had never entered, in a building she had walked past 100 times. Fluorescent lights, a long table, water glasses no one touched. Harold sat at one end with his attorney, a man in a grey suit who looked like he had been hired to make silence sound expensive. Martin sat beside Ruth with a single folder. Inside the folder were copies of everything. Outside the folder was the truth, and it was no longer hiding. Harold did not look at Ruth when she entered. He looked at the table. He looked at his attorney. He looked at the wall behind Martin's shoulder. He looked at everything in the room except the woman he had spent 30 years teaching not to look back. Ruth noticed. She sat down and folded her hands on the table. They were steady. The conversation lasted less than 2 hours. Martin did not raise his voice. He did not perform outrage. He placed documents on the table, the way Eleanor placed stitches in fabric one at a time, each one connected to the one before each one, pulling the truth tighter until it held the shape of something that could not be denied. Harold's attorney asked for a recess twice. Both times Harold returned looking smaller. Not physically. Something behind his posture had shifted the way a building shifts when the ground beneath it is no longer solid. The terms were agreed to before noon. The sale of Eleanor's house was financially corrected. Ruth received compensation from the contested transaction. The cabin trust was confirmed publicly, legally, permanently. 16 acres of wooded Ohio land, the cabin, the split oak, the dirt road, and every root and stone between them belonged to Ruth Calloway in a way that no calm voice and no polished shoes could ever undo. The buyers of Eleanor's house, who had known nothing of Harold's fraud, were allowed to keep the property after proper legal adjustments. Ruth could have resented them. She did not. They had been used the same way she had been used, as surfaces on which Harold projected the appearance of legitimacy. Harold signed the settlement. He did not apologize. He did not lower his eyes. He signed the way he did everything, with controlled, efficient strokes, as if the act of agreeing was simply another transaction, and not the collapse of a lie he had spent years constructing. The notary issue was referred for review. Harold's name entered the county record in a way he had never intended, not as a property owner, not as a businessman, but as a man whose signature now sat beside a question mark. Ruth stepped outside into November sunlight. Martin walked beside her slowly, carrying his single folder. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, he stopped. His voice came through quiet, almost private. Rose would have been proud. Eleanor, too. Ruth looked at the square. The same brick buildings, the same benches, the same people carrying coffee and car keys and grocery bags. Nothing in Chillicothe had changed. Everything in Ruth had. She drove back to the cabin before the light failed. The first thing she saw was the porch. Walter had come while she was gone. The old boards had been replaced with the white oak planks he had brought weeks earlier. Sanded, smooth-nailed, true level enough to hold a rocking chair without complaint. He had not asked permission. He had not left a note. He had simply done the work and left the way people in small towns do things for each other when the doing matters more than the being thanked. On the porch railing, a clay pot held a rosemary plant, its needles dark green, its roots wrapped in burlap. Beside it, a folded note in Della Finch's handwriting. Your mother always said every kitchen needs something living nearby. Ruth carried the rosemary inside. She placed it on the windowsill above the sink where the morning light would reach it first. The cabin smelled of oak smoke and cold earth, and the faint lavender that still rose from the sewing tin no matter how many times Ruth opened it, as if Eleanor had soaked the metal itself in the scent of her own presence. She hung the photograph of young Eleanor and baby Ruth on the wall beside the stove next to the cabin photograph from the sewing tin. Beside both, she pinned the old picture of Rose Calloway she had found tucked in the back of the metal box, a woman standing straight as a fence post. Arms crossed, eyes sharp, looking into the camera with the expression of someone who had never once apologized for knowing what she knew. 3 generations of Calloway women, each one ordinary, each one quiet, each one capable of hiding the truth inside something no one thought to search. Then Ruth sat at the table and did the last thing Eleanor's letter had asked of her. She wrote, not for Martin, not for the court, not for Harold. She wrote for the woman who would come after her, the daughter or granddaughter or great-niece who might one day stand outside a house that had been taken holding a box of things that looked worthless, wondering whether her own memory could be trusted. Ruth wrote what happened. She wrote it plainly, without bitterness, without legal language, without any word Harold would have used. She wrote the dates, she wrote the names. She wrote what Eleanor had hidden and why. She wrote what Rose had built and how. She wrote about the sewing tin and the brass key and the split oak and the letter that began with love instead of fear. And at the bottom of the page, she wrote one line that was not for the record. It was for the next woman. Your memory is enough. It has always been enough. She folded the page and placed it inside the sewing tin. Not beneath the false bottom, not hidden, not locked. She placed it on top beside the thread and the buttons and the silver thimble where anyone who opened the lid would find it first. The tin sat on the shelf in the last November light. Its painted flowers faced the window. Its dented corner caught the fading sun. Inside it were no secrets anymore, no keys, no buried instructions. Only thread buttons, a thimble scraps of cloth, and a single page that said what had happened and why it mattered. Ruth closed the cabin door, not to hide, not to run, not because someone had told her she could. She closed it because the day was ending, and the fire was warm, and the rosemary on the windowsill smelled like her mother's kitchen. On a morning when the flower hung in the air and the radio played something with strings, and a woman who never spoke much rolled pie dough with steady hands while her daughter sat nearby learning without knowing. She was learning that love does not always announce itself. Sometimes it hides inside ordinary things. A tin of thread, a brass key, a pouch sewn 6 weeks before death, a trust built by a grandmother who feared the future and prepared for it anyway. A letter that waits in the dark beneath the dirt behind the lock until the right hands find it. And the sewing tin, dented and painted with flowers that had faded past recognition, sat on the shelf of a cabin in the Ohio hills, holding everything and nothing open to whoever came next. Outside, the split oak stood against the last light, its 2 trunks reaching in opposite directions, scarred where the break had been grown over, where the healing had held wide enough now to shelter the ground beneath it from rain and snow, and the weight of every season that had tried to bring it down. If this story reminded you of someone who prepared a way for you before you even knew you needed it, give it a like. Subscribe before the next story begins, because quiet love is the hardest kind to see and the last kind to disappear. And tell us in the comments, was there ever someone in your life who hid something precious inside something ordinary, just so it would be there when you finally knew where to look?